Picture a South African military general, resplendent in full uniform, standing in Tehran, shaking hands, making commitments, and appearing to align himself with one of the most controversial governments on the global stage. Now imagine that same general speaking publicly on matters of foreign policy as though he were the head of state, declaring shared goals with Iran, endorsing its position on Gaza, and calling for deeper strategic alignment between the two countries. The problem with this picture is stark and unavoidable. None of this falls within his constitutional mandate. What makes the situation especially explosive is its timing. South Africa is currently attempting to repair and stabilize its diplomatic relationship with the United States, its second-largest trading partner and a country whose influence over South Africa's economy is significant. This is therefore not simply a story about one senior officer's questionable judgment, it is a tale of foreign policy confusion, military discipline under scrutiny, and the fragile balance between diplomacy and disaster. At the center of this growing storm is General Rudzani, chief of the South African National Defence Force, whose recent visit to Iran has triggered a political and diplomatic firestorm at home. While the Department of Defense has insisted that the trip was officially sanctioned, the remarks Maphwanya made during his time in Tehran have drawn fierce criticism, with many describing them as ill-advised, unconstitutional, and a clear violation of the principle of military neutrality that underpins democratic governance. Some observers have gone as far as calling for his immediate court-martial, while others argue that the controversy exposes a deeper, systemic problem, a lack of coordination, oversight, and discipline at the highest levels of South Africa's security establishment. According to official statements, Maphwanya's visit was not a rogue mission. Acting Defense spokesperson Anukika Kwakwa, speaking on behalf of Defense Minister Thandi Mochika, confirmed that the general traveled to Iran with full ministerial approval. The justification offered was that the visit fell within the scope of a 2016 Memorandum of Understanding between South Africa and Iran, which provides a framework for ongoing defense cooperation. On paper, this positioned the trip as a routine exercise in military-to-military diplomacy, something not uncommon in international relations. However, events quickly veered off script. While in Tehran, General Maphwanya reportedly expressed open solidarity with Iran's foreign policy positions, voiced support for its stance on Gaza, and publicly called for closer strategic alignment between South Africa and Iran. These remarks did far more than raise a few diplomatic eyebrows, they set off alarm bells across government and diplomatic circles in South Africa. Under the country's constitutional framework, foreign policy is the exclusive domain of the President and the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. The role of the military is to implement policy, not to shape or publicly articulate it. Even the Department of Defense appeared to concede that the general may have crossed a line. Kwakwa acknowledged that Minister Mochika intended to meet with Maphwanya to express concern over his statements, stressing that the final decision on any consequences would rest with President Cyril Ramaphosa in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief. Whether this will result in a quiet reprimand, a formal warning, or full disciplinary proceedings remains unclear, but the opposition Democratic Alliance has wasted no time in demanding accountability. Chris Hattingh, the DA spokesperson on defense matters, described Maphwanya's actions as a blatant violation of the SANDF Code of Conduct, which requires strict political neutrality from serving officers. In Hattingh's view, the only appropriate response is an immediate court-martial, conducted publicly to reaffirm the apolitical nature of the military and to send an unmistakable message that no officer, regardless of rank, stands above the Constitution. The argument advanced by the DA is straightforward and uncompromising. Serving members of the armed forces are explicitly prohibited from making political statements, particularly on sensitive international issues. By publicly endorsing the policies of a foreign government, especially one as controversial and heavily scrutinized as Iran, Maphwanya undermined the very constitutional principles the military is sworn to defend. The seriousness of the incident is compounded by its timing. South Africa is currently engaged in delicate efforts to reset and stabilize its relationship with the United States. Over the past 2 years, tensions have simmered amid perceptions in Washington that Pretoria is drifting closer to Russia, its outspoken stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict, and broader concerns that South Africa may be aligning itself with anti-Western blocs. The United States has a long institutional memory, and South Africa's economy, which is deeply dependent on trade, investment, and market confidence, leaves little margin for diplomatic miscalculations. Foreign policy errors are not merely symbolic, they can translate into tangible economic costs measured in billions of rand. At a press briefing following the controversy, presidential spokesperson Vincent Magwenya described Maphwaya's comments as deeply concerning and ill-advised given the current geopolitical climate. He reiterated that foreign policy pronouncements fall squarely within the authority of the president and not the military, emphasizing that senior officers speaking out of turn risk undermining the coherence of South Africa's diplomatic messaging. Magwenya also pointed to a broader frustration within the presidency, noting that disinformation and misinterpretation of South Africa's foreign policy, both domestically and internationally, are persistent challenges. When high-ranking officials make unsanctioned or ambiguous statements, they fuel narratives that contradict the government's intended position, weakening its ability to present a unified and credible stance on the world stage. For the DA, Maphwaya's conduct is not an isolated lapse in judgment but part of a wider pattern of what it describes as foreign policy adventurism. Hatting argues that ministers, generals, and other senior officials increasingly operate independently on international matters, often without adequate coordination or oversight. The predictable result is a stream of mixed signals that lead to diplomatic embarrassment and, in some cases, real damage to strategic relationships. The Iran dimension adds a particularly sensitive layer to the controversy. Tehran is not simply another international partner, it is a state heavily sanctioned by the United States and its allies, accused of serious human rights violations, and deeply entangled in Middle Eastern conflicts through its support for groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah. Even symbolic gestures of alignment with Iran can be interpreted by Washington as South Africa taking sides in a highly polarized geopolitical environment, potentially jeopardizing critical trade and diplomatic ties. South Africa's fragile economic position further amplifies these risks. The rand is notoriously sensitive to political developments, and any perception of a diplomatic rift with the United States could trigger investor anxiety, weaken the currency, and drive up the cost of imports. When a top military official makes public statements that could be perceived as antagonistic to a key trading partner, the potential economic consequences are neither theoretical nor distant, they are immediate and concrete. Some defenders of Maphwanya have suggested that his remarks were merely expressions of goodwill, customary in the context of international military diplomacy, where visiting officials often offer warm words to their hosts. Yet context matters. In an era of heightened Middle Eastern tensions and intense Western scrutiny, words spoken by senior officials carry extraordinary weight. For members of the armed forces, the oath of office is binding and explicit, they must remain apolitical and refrain from engaging in political commentary. The pressing question now is how this incident will ultimately be handled. Will it be resolved quietly behind closed doors, or will it escalate into a public confrontation involving the presidency, the Department of Defense, and the SANDF? The DA's call for a court-martial seeks to force the issue into the open, framing it as a necessary test of accountability and constitutional principle. Should President Ramaphosa and Minister Machika opt for a softer approach, they are likely to face sharp criticism for appearing to tolerate a senior officer crossing a clear constitutional boundary without meaningful consequences. Beneath the immediate controversy lies a deeper and more troubling question: who truly governs South Africa's foreign policy? Constitutionally, the answer is unambiguous: the President and the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. In practice, however, recent years have revealed a far more chaotic reality, with multiple voices competing for attention on the international stage. At times these voices appear to harmonize, but more often they clash, leaving allies, partners, and investors uncertain about South Africa's true position. All eyes are now on the anticipated meeting between Minister Motshekga and General Maphwanya, followed by the President's final decision. Whether Maphwanya receives a private reprimand or becomes the subject of a high-profile disciplinary process will signal how seriously civilian authorities intend to enforce control over the military. The stakes extend far beyond internal SANDF discipline. They touch on South Africa's credibility as a coherent and reliable actor in international affairs. Foreign policy is not an abstract exercise conducted in distant conference rooms. It directly affects jobs, trade flows, investment decisions, and currency stability. A single poorly timed remark in Tehran may appear minor in isolation, but in the interconnected worlds of diplomacy and economics, it can generate far-reaching consequences that ultimately impact ordinary South Africans. In essence, this is not merely a story about one general's visit to Iran. It is a story about discipline, constitutional order, and the fine line between cultivating international relationships and safeguarding national interests. General Maphwanya may have believed he was strengthening ties, but depending on how events unfold, he may instead have ignited a political and diplomatic crisis. The episode serves as a stark reminder of the military's role in a democratic society. The SANDF is entrusted with defending the nation, not with setting its political or diplomatic agenda. Officers swear an oath to uphold the Constitution, obey civilian leadership, and remain impartial. Any deviation from this principle risks destabilizing diplomatic relationships and eroding public confidence in the armed forces themselves. The broader implications for South Africa cannot be overstated. Missteps at this level of military and diplomatic engagement reverberate across political, economic, and social spheres. When foreign policy is muddied by unsanctioned statements, it weakens the government's negotiating power, damages strategic partnerships, and can send shockwaves through financial markets. The incident also raises serious questions about internal discipline within the SANDF, underscoring the need for robust oversight, clear protocols, and unwavering adherence to constitutional boundaries. As President Ramaphosa weighs his response, observers at home and abroad will be watching closely. Whether he chooses a measured, behind-the-scenes approach or a decisive, public disciplinary action, the outcome will set an important precedent for the future conduct of senior officers. It will also reveal the extent to which civilian authorities are prepared to assert control over the military in moments of controversy. For now, South Africa finds itself navigating the fallout from a single general's words spoken far from home, words that have exposed vulnerabilities at the intersection of military authority and foreign policy. What may have seemed like a minor diplomatic gesture has instead illuminated deeper tensions within the state, with implications for the country's international standing, economic stability, and democratic governance. Ultimately, the controversy surrounding General Rudzani Maphwanya stands as a cautionary tale about the delicate balance between military authority and civilian oversight, between international engagement and national interest. It is a reminder that in a world where words can be as consequential as actions, discipline, constitutional fidelity, and careful coordination are not optional, they are essential. Whether this episode becomes a lesson in accountability or a warning about the dangers of unchecked power will depend entirely on how South Africa's leadership chooses to respond.